Even with the BCCC, which has a self-regulatory code for broadcasters, there is often like subjective interpretation of what the code should be, right? Even if there were to be something like that for online content, how would this work? Because everyone would be doing different things.
You've seen the case of self-regulation in case of ASCII also. And last session we were mostly discussing about, snake oil. And normal newspapers, channels, magazine, all of them carry advertisement for snake oils. And ASCII is there for many years. So that is why that is the most important thing of not having a self-regulatory mechanism. That is one. Second, what self-regulation, what we understand by self-regulation in our country is that every industry guy will sign on to it, which makes sure that the crooks will not sign on to it and they will not be governed by it. Okay. The self-regulation that we understand as internet industry is that every of my portals who are doing legitimate business have their own self-declared rules and regulations of controlling themselves and their community. That is what we understand by self-regulation. So Netflix will have certain kind of signage. It may not be the same as Amazon Prime, but they do have some community practices in place. Because they are controlling their own selves and their own communities. Okay. And the third point, which is not discussed, is that if you have regulations, sometimes it is better because then you will not have extra regulatory impositions. Many of these takedowns happen on the phone and on vile threats. If you have it written down in some place that this is the regulation under such circumstances, you will have to take down, which is what IT Act has done after many years.
Yeah.
And we'll comply with it. We don't get extra legal notices because there is a law. So don't discount properly written law if you have to fight this extra legal stuff. Today it's very easy to call up an editor of a newspaper and say, don't carry this story. You cannot do it with any internet news portal, you see, because we are governed by the IT Act.
How do we define obscenity? This is a vague sort of
A word, yes.
yeah, it's a vague sort of word and it would obviously lead to subjective interpretation. Game of Thrones would be obscene and maybe a Ravi Kishan film is not, and it would be the other way around for somebody else.
So I think whatever obscenity laws already exist are kind of sufficient because you have to understand there's a high level of self-regulation that already exists in the entertainment industry. Because the entertainment industry is huge. Each product, I'm not talking about user-generated content here for the reason I already mentioned earlier. Each movie or show that comes out has, a certain level of restraint that is shown at every stage of production. So at scripting, the scriptwriter wants to kind of pull themselves back and bring their content in line with what a producer expects. A producer will look at scripts in line with what the audience expects. A director is going to make judgment calls about some parts of the script when the actual movie is being shot. And in post-production, there is a lot of self-regulation that already exists in this value system. So obscenity is pretty much what society considers unacceptable.
Exactly.
Right? So when you have an industry that is so necessarily intertwined with the expectations of what society considers acceptable, I think the question of obscenity mostly remains theoretical. As compared to news, where,
I'm going to play devil's advocate here. And there was, with online entertainment, we're always left with a we're playing a game of whack-a-mole, isn't it, all the time. So YouTube was banned in Pakistan, and this band called Begairat Brigade put up this lovely song called Aloo Ande. Please listen to it if you haven't, it's lovely. Which was on Vimeo. And they ran into a bit of trouble because of that as well. And then that started getting carried in other channels elsewhere. Do we need, or how do we have online regulation accounting for that?
You regulate, I heard this at one of the previous open houses, you regulate for the norm, not for the exception. Okay. The thing that you mentioned there is something that happens very rarely. It's not a common thing that, a channel grabs something off the internet and it leads to one of the world's biggest internet companies being banned from the entire country. That's a very...
And that, again, the song they got into trouble for was on Vimeo then, not even on YouTube.
Exactly.
Okay, so
yeah. I have a couple of questions. One is that why are we here? Is there, and this is specifically to Subho because you have a broader understanding of what's going on and why are we here? Why is it that we're in a situation where the government wants to regulate online entertainment content, is there a particular incident or an instance or something that has happened that has made them do this?
Or are they foreseeing one?
Or rather foreseeing one?
So there was a similar question asked at the last session by the gentleman sitting in that corner, that why is the government doing it? I think my first submission is that it is not government which is doing it. It is the state which is doing it. And through a wrong instrument. All right. Because previous governments have done similar things or even worse things. And I'm no supporter of any government. I'm basically an anarchist.
We all remember Kapil Sibal and pre-censorship from that perspective.
Yeah. They are doing it. Again, I go back to what Vibodh and I were discussing. They may do it for any reason, but it is for us to ask them why you're doing it and do some evidence-based regulation. This is what we were discussing earlier. Government or the state may have some reason which are vague, some reason which are. Let's not get there. Let's ask them that if you have a reason, please state it while you're making a law. If you look at the good laws that have been made through public consultation, they state the purpose of the law. And then you can ask them that this is the purpose you're trying to achieve. This is not the law that you make. You start questioning from there. And the other thing that is very important here to discuss is that when you have a written law, as opposed to a self-regulation, that is implemented by the court, not by the government it's a different arm of the state.
My second question was from a legal perspective, and anyone can address that, is around what is the kind of mechanism that they have, what is the kind of jurisdiction do they have to regulate online content? Because, it's not licensed, for one, so there are no license conditions to comply with. So should we be expecting a law coming in place for online content? What sort of a framework should we expect here? To be able to enforce a law, first you need some sort of statutory backing to be able to enforce certain norms from a particular group of people. You need to have a sort of a statutory backing and a ability to, let's say, impose a penalty or to cancel a license, sanction. So what is it here that they have over online content?
Evidence-based, that you show us cases, you show us incidents where large sections of your citizens have been kind of violated or offended, or you have data for that.
No, so if they do bring in
if they bring in a law, they will have all these things in the place.
They'll bring in a law, but is there any other possibility, like if they bring in a code of conduct or they bring some sort of rules in, is there an existing law under which they can bring in these rules?
So government bringing a code of conduct, not a law, is actually illegal. Like government taking out a white paper.
Okay. Government bringing in rules. Bring in rules for this particular sector.
So they have to draw from some law, you see. They can't just fetch it out of the thin air.
I want to raise a point that Arun had raised earlier in this context about the Punjab government establishing this culture commission, looking into Punjabi pop songs that glorify violence, misogyny. How would you look at that in this context then?
I think that is something that will be enforced by the state in a prosecutorial, role. So they will most likely kind of step in and be like, okay, we don't think this content is acceptable, and we will use, civil or criminal law to kind of come against you if you.
But this, this is something that they're looking at in a generic sort of way, not just online. Yeah,
exactly. So they are not. This is a platform agnostic kind of undertaking, right? So. There is really nothing you can do if the state is going to come and say that the state, in this sense, Punjab, says that, okay, if we judge that you are going to do something like this, we will come after you.
And this again, when it comes to online, say if there's a Honey Singh song on YouTube, and if the Punjab Culture Commission says this is not on, can I still watch it in Karnataka? Exactly. Where does the jurisdiction? How do we deal with jurisdiction then?
I think the reaction to this kind of content that they have the power to kind of do is not to tell YouTube to take down the content, but to actually punish the creators. So if you have a state-specific culture commission where the people who created this problematic content, who commissioned this problematic content are residing, then obviously the only kind of powers they have, because they don't have any internet-related powers except to kind of shut it down, is to just basically say that, okay, we are hauling you in for obscenity. We are using the state police to do it, and we are essentially using courts to kind of.
So punitive measures for the creator, not the intermediary.
Exactly, and not to the viewer.
And not to the viewer. Okay.
A lot of this conversation usually comes back to sort of like an opposition between platform agnosticity on the one hand And on the other hand, where we say that so either content is completely platform agnostic, or we have online regulation which may or may not be different from other from the regulation of the same content on other platforms, which is seen to be, I mean, on principle unfair. But we've been talking about the harms-based approach in the context of data protection and other things, where we're moving towards that, and I think Arpita made a reference to this as well, where at some point, instead of talking about it in terms of black and white, yes and no, maybe we should be looking at levels of scrutiny, or at what point do we start also bringing in the idea of harms, and how far does that tie in with the discussion on platform agnosticity or difference? So that's something I think that we should bring into this debate and consider as well, and sort of use that to create a balance in terms of levels of scrutiny, or where we don't have a yes and no answer all the time, also in terms of regulation.
So is it more like you're saying that a certain level of harm foreseen should have a certain kind of sanction and so on and so forth?
Okay, let's try to make it very specific. Say harm caused in terms of promoting enmity, which is anyway defined in the statute of the law. So if we take it forward from there, then how do you deal with that?
Oh,
yeah.
So for in instances of self-regulation, for a lot of other media, there are code of conducts and policies that already address hate speech, for instance. So in the report that's outside on hate speech laws, there are chapters that discuss how print media and broadcast media, even specifically the non-news television and news television agencies, address hate speech specifically. There isn't a classification in the way that you're saying is that a certain type of
right, and my point was not to do with, it would take a lot more discussion and nuance to get into, particular kinds of speech, and to what extent each needs to be regulated. And I think that would have to be a specific discussion. But, the broader idea of not saying either on the one hand, which tends to happen sometimes, as pointed out in the last session, that we have certain kinds of regulations for online content because of the IT Act now, which do not maybe exist for print media or other forms of media. On the other hand, saying that all content should always be completely platform agnostic, which tends to ignore, the kind of scale that online content tends to have, and which has led to real world consequences. So really to sort of keep both those perspectives in mind, and while we try to stick to platform agnosticity, to also bring in the harms-based approach, or the impact-based approach, as it could also be called, at certain levels, and how that applies to different kinds of content would necessarily have to be a more specific discussion. But really the debate needs to become more nuanced to include that, is my point, as opposed to, remain into completely, not mutually exclusive or antagonistic stands.
Shubho has a point on that.
So just to dissect your question in two parts. One is the part about parity laws that you mentioned across platforms, whether it's news or whether it's a broadcaster or a radio channel or an internet platform, right? That was the first part of your question.
Right.
So
it wasn't really a question.
I mean, the discussion that you started to have.
Yeah.
So on that, let me tell you, currently, there is a lot of obfuscation about what are the laws that internet companies or platforms follow. Right. I think one thing is very sure, that we follow all the other laws of the land, plus we follow the IT Act.
Right, exactly.
Okay, IT Act.
That is exactly where my point is coming from.
Yeah, so the IT Act is an act which has got just one favorable kind of developmental or favorable business aspect, which is Section 79. Apart from that, all the other provisions are penal provisions, actually.
Right.
Okay, and it is a hodgepodge of all the existing laws.
Absolutely. Which
basically says, the entire IT Act says that there are 80 other laws in this land, so you have to follow all these land. If you don't follow, then you are punished. Section 79 is the only, so there is a lot of parity already. Most of us follow the same kind of rules and regulations, and we have an extra imposition on 79. That is the only freedom that is given to us.
Right, and that is exactly where I'm coming from, that we need to get back into the purpose for which this is done. I mean, even this discussion is about online content regulation. That's what the ministry has been set up for. That's what the IT Act, like you said, is for. That's what the new data protection laws will govern. So we are sort of creating, on the one hand, this other space of online regulation and talking about to what extent whether it should be regulated. And on the other hand, there's this huge pushback saying that there has to be complete platform agnosticity. So I think the way to delve a bit deeper into that is to question the purpose behind online regulation, and to answer those questions, we look at what is the object of it, which in certain cases might be the kind of harm that online content can create, which other forms of media could not because of the nature of the technology. And to that extent, we need to bring in the harms-based approach. So even if the IT Act or the data protection law were to look at it this way, that may lead to internal checks on how far we...
You're saying it would shave off a lot of superfluous sort of regulations.
Right, and and it might help to actually prevent the kind of situation that was just pointed out, where online content is anyway regulated under the existing laws, and to what extent do we need additional regulation, to be clear on that, as well as to what extent it is
whether
already regulated
right.
under existing laws, because that tends to get obfuscated as well. Because also the fact that a lot of online content leads to real world offline harms as well, especially when it comes to child pornography, revenge porn and things like that, which do need regulation in the online space.
Yeah, so as far as entertainment goes, I think it's safe to be reactive in your approach to regulating content. So if you have a real world harm that comes as a result of a movie, for example, we had the Innocence of Muslims, I think. Innocence of Muslims. So that essentially caused a lot of unrest in Libya, and there was technically nothing that was illegal about the movie, but if it was made in Libya as opposed to the United States, then they could essentially arrest the filmmaker and kind of appease the protesters and take steps that would placate the people in the real world who are mad, because no matter what content gets distributed, it's always people in the real world who are consuming it and who are acting based on that information. So I think it's always important, instead of going directly to a regulatory fix that kind of tries to preempt harm, to actually wait for harm as it comes and deal with it intelligently, rather than saying that, oh, it spreads fastly, so we must try to curtail it in some way.
That was a point that was discussed in the earlier panel as well, about the speed.
Yeah, so in fact, one of the things I want to go back to is something we discussed in the last panel, which was around how do you define, let's say, an aggregator in this case? How do you define a broadcaster in this case on the internet? If I start a blog and I start aggregating all sorts of videos there, how am I different from, let's say, a commercial entity like a Netflix or an Amazon? If I'm running Google ads on that, then I'm a commercial entity again. Right? So how do you then create a situation where you're distinguishing between one type of aggregator versus another? Also, how do you distinguish between, let's say, user-generated content and personal videos that are put up on platforms versus stuff that is professionally sort of created? This is, I mean, we have a definitional challenge here as well. So videos shared on, so like, yeah. So if you're, and exactly, so then this differentiation between unicast, which is almost like a video call, versus narrowcast, which is with a specific set of people, versus broadcast. How do you sort of, is there going to be a situation where users who are publishing content have greater protection under free speech as opposed to professional entities that are actually creating content then? And I mean, the same point I'd raised in the last one as well. Which is where
Arpita also raised that point about reach, I think, which is where that point comes in. A professional creator would have a far greater reach, presumably.
Again, see,
unless you're going viral, like
rules and then how do you create a threshold beyond which? Because we had this discussion when we were looking at the statement that was issued from the news players also. The 100 journalists who signed up. I was a part of the drafting team for that. And there was this discussion that should the regulation apply beyond a particular level, larger players have to be under greater scrutiny. There are ways of bypassing all of that, but laws and rules are not based on necessarily on the size of the player or the potential size of a player or the funding of a player, but it should be based on the principles involved over here. Principally, how do you distinguish between user-generated content and an aggregator? That's something which I can't sort of figure out. Does anyone have an answer? Answers, anyone have an answer? Okay, you have an answer.
I think there's no way to figure out any difference, and it's stupid to try and classify news and entertainment and different kinds of content. There are no differences. And we are essentially stuck in this rut because we are still thinking from the old framework. We need to start classifying these things as data and information. The moment we start classifying things as data and information, a lot of things will start clearing up. Speech being, there being free speech versus commodified content, these are meaningless distinctions. Everything is commoditized on the internet. Your speech is, every comment that you put is being monetized. Every image that you put is being monetized. Everything is commoditized.
So therefore, commercial, non-commercial distinction.
There is no distinction. There is no distinction.
Okay. There's a point here.
Yeah. So I don't think. So I just want to float in an idea here. I don't think commercial versus non-commercial distinction would be the right approach here. There is no reason why we can't follow the current intermediary liability principles in the same manner. So, for example, under the intermediary liability regime, actual knowledge is what constitutes the test for liability.
In which case, there's a reporting mechanism, and there was a
notice and takedown.
There was
mechanism.
a 36 hours, I think. Was it 36 hours?
36 hours.
Before the reading down.
Yeah.
Which has been read down, and then it's a 30-day period. But I think taking the same example as you were giving, user-generated content versus, let's say, somebody who's blogging and just merely aggregates content, I think the test could also be whether the aggregator has actual knowledge of the content, or is it an automated algorithms which are simply using links from other websites and merely putting it on a platform, or is there some element of human review and actual knowledge involved? So potentially that could be one of the tests, which is well established under the intermediary liability.
Fair enough, an actual knowledge test. Okay. How do you deal with automated systems?
So if it's an automated system, you don't have actual knowledge. Actual knowledge will be imputed to you if you get a court order or a government notified agency's request. So then once you receive those, you get actual knowledge and you're supposed to take down the content, barring which you don't have liability over the automatically generated content.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in general, like regulation seems to be a bad word in this room, so I'm a little wary of saying, but I think in specific categories of content, for example, in entertainment, so kids content would be something that fall into it. Now again, we might extend the argument that kids content and the problems with it, violence and so on and so forth has existed in all kind of content, whether television, etc. But I think with the technology and the way it's disseminated, I think there are a lot of problems of manipulation, that there is a lot of manipulation that happens. Further, we can say...
Manipulation in the sense, can you please?
So, I mean, for example, on Netflix, if a child is watching content because there is an autoplay, of course, the parent is the regulator. So it's the parent's job to stop the child and say that no more, etc. But also on YouTube, the child is watching certain videos, and those things have been out where YouTube is trying to control, where, you know, ELSA and all those figures. There's a technical term for that word, right? Where these are all, you know, there's a lot of violence, there's gory images, and the child doesn't know. And probably the parent should be there, but isn't there. So the point, I'm not saying that the parents need to be less accountable for what they're saying. I'm just saying that should there be more accountability on part of platforms like YouTube, like Netflix.
So there is some level of accountability that has come in case of YouTube, which has been brought in by their advertisers. So a lot of the hate speech content, especially the neo-Nazi content, advertisers pull their advertising out of YouTube, and they had to clamp down fairly strongly. And I think commercial responses is one way of it that it's dealt with.
But I'm just saying that in India, in general, about if you talk about kids content, kids advertising, etc., like this is much more regulated in US or UK, etc. In general, I think it's one dimension where I think we could do with more regulation. So I thought we could discuss.
Just to extend that advertising point, last year something did happen. Someone on Medium did post an in-depth observation of this trend of videos that were intended at child entrapment. Basically, having a whole playlist of similar videos that were designed around what a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old would kind of click on and watch. And after that Medium report came out, advertisers doubled down. More advertisers started pulling out, and YouTube started doing more. They removed thousands of hours of such content, and they added rules to their
I
community
know, but the
guidelines.
irony even there was that the YouTube didn't do it for...
Exactly, because it was reactive.
I'm saying, yeah, it wasn't for the interest of the users. The users were not a priority. It was for the interest, obviously, of the
Yeah,
advertisers.
but it happened. It happened nonetheless. In the end,
Can I just
Sorry,
answer this very specifically? Can I answer that very specifically?
Yeah, so
See,
Shubho,
there is a
then
problem with platforms. I wouldn't say the problem. There is a complicated relationship between safe harbor provisions and actually going and taking content from your own site. For example, if you're saying that a certain type of content YouTube should edit on its own, it will not be given safe harbor provisions under the IT Act of any country. So therefore, the moment you touch the content, see it, you are liable for it. It is very difficult for them to do it. You see, that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. If you want safe harbor provisions, you have to at all time claim that you have not seen, not touched, not edited that content. The moment you say, yes, I mark a A here or a U there, which is assumed that you've seen it, therefore you're liable for it, for the whole of the platform. That's the complicated aspect of it. But any curated site will of course have those markings. Whether it's an adult site or any site will have that marking.
I want to bring in one very specific case, because specific cases are what help us make more generic policies or consider them. Because you raised the point of children's content. I was just looking that up so that I have the exact information. Peppa Pig, a popular children's cartoon, has been censored in China because there were certain organized crime syndicates that had begun associating with it. So lots of Peppa Pig cartoon shows have vanished off the internet in China. Where are you left with that when something like that happens?
So, but to be fair, this goes back to the issue of harm there. And at least in our constitution, the harm to the state has been clearly defined. The harm to the society has not been defined, you see. So if we were China, we would ask our state that if you ban this cartoon site for children, please show us harm to the state. That is the benefit of having a written constitution.
And just to say that also, but harm to the society is also relevant, right? Because public interest and concepts like that do exist.
So they are relevant, but if I may be very candid, even in the case of pornography, no state has been shown able to prove harm. You see, even a judge has said in the United States that what is pornography? If I see one, I know it. See, so you get into a slippery slope. What is harm to you may not be harm to me, and so on and so forth. That's the problem with proving social harm.
I think what Shubho said earlier was very interesting. He said, in the end, everybody is responsible for the content they create. And I think that's the most fundamental point I'm hearing here, because you can ban something in one geographical area and it can be watched somewhere else. You can ban an unfreedom here, you can watch it in the United States. You can, there are cuss words that you don't allow in India, but it's allowed everywhere else. You can watch Stephen Colbert here, which with full of, and John Oliver more than that, with the cuss words, which wouldn't pass through any Indian news channel. So I think what we're seeing is a calling out of hypocrisy in many ways, because I found, to be honest with you guys, I found even the whole noise about that movie that was banned recently, nearly banned, and then...
Lipstick under my burqa? Lots of them.
Padmavat. Sorry. Padmavat. The name was changed in the end. Lots of public property was destroyed, but guess what? It's making piles of money all over the place. So I think what we need to understand is what constitutes, again, going back to what you said earlier in the earlier discussion, a sense of self-coding, a self-code of conduct or self-regulation by the content creators themselves. I do agree with the panel on the fact that child content and child porn and so on probably needs more regulation than anything else, because that's something that is very difficult to control in many ways. But again, you cannot control what your kid looks at on YouTube or whatever. You can aggregate YouTubes on a website and then be accused of running a porn website, for example. So I think in the end, my question is are our laws? Somebody said that the IT law is an aggregation of all the jurisdiction, all the laws that already exist. Do we actually have a way of getting out of this trap of trying to define what is obscenity, decency, and hate speech or incitement to hate. There has never been any, and Shiva, I think, again made a good point. You should ask the guys to show you examples of what exactly has triggered any of these thoughts. What has been the outcome? Has there been any actual harm done? Apart from burning a few buses and so on, what are we talking about in terms of the outcome of bad language, for example? You're going to have more and more armies of people bleeping out words on Netflix and everywhere else now, very soon.
My fear is, and perhaps one of the reasons why I'm sitting here today is, my fear is that this sort of fear that there is today in television, iska naam nahi lena hai, iska story nahi karna hai, can it be the way you are seeing things? Could it be tomorrow, very soon, that this will be here? Because you know what? Child pornography is a given. Obviously, it needs to be regulated. There is no debate over it. The intent of the government is very clear where it wants to focus on. And when we say that political satire is not news, look at the American example, by the way, where political satirists are taken more seriously than your 9 o'clock anchors. Tell me one 9 o'clock anchor in America versus all the Stephen Colberts and the Trevor Noahs that we are hearing about. So, Shubha, please tell me if there is actual seriousness on the part of the government to really control what is happening as far as online is concerned and what their intent could be.
See, again, let us differentiate between the government and the state. Okay. So state will always want to control the action of its citizens. That will remain throughout. As long as there is a state, we have all given our sovereignty to the state. That's how, Westphalian democracy works, right? And this state, our state, seems to have claimed that they have right over our bodies also. So that is a struggle between the citizens and the state. Now, my limited submission was that if you are doing a control through a properly written constitution-abiding law, you have some recourse to judiciary. If you are doing it on the phone, or if you are doing it through an RBI directive, and you are completely withdrawing it when there is public pressure, that is not the proper way to make a law. That is one. Secondly, I always believe that state will get out, current government or any other government will get out on these fishing expeditions. Rather than question why they're coming and discuss amongst ourselves, let's go and tell them why you're doing it. Let's push them back. You see, we can do it. We have done it the internet companies have done it for the past 15 years in India. The problem is we are treated in the same manner as other people, and then we are expected to comply with the greater laws of the land.
I want to.
So I think whatever you're doing, keep doing. The traditional broadcasters have editors. They will judge. Put it up on non-curated platforms. I think you'll be happy.
I have a few points. Just from the latest point that you made, I think it's important to just remind everyone that it's not like there's fear on TV. I can tell you because I work with NDTV for 11 years. And I can say this very clearly right now, that it's not fear that is basically garnered by a particular government or the state. What it is basically a situation that we're put into as a channel that even Siddharth mentioned in the previous discussion. And that's not necessarily fear. That is basically pushing us and putting us against the wall. That is what happens. When a lot of our employees have to be laid off for particular reasons, it's not because of fear. It's because we're continuing to fight and we're continuing to actually talk about truth. It's basically about the fact that at the end of the day, it's about money. If the money is not, most of the channels, the private news channels get a lot of money from government ads. When you are not given government ad money, suddenly, because the government has changed, then you lose a lot of the money that you were supposed to get. That's one. The second point I wanted to make about entertainment and obscenity that you were referring to. You said, sir, at the start that all news channels are entertainment. I completely contest that. I write the headlines for my news channel every day, and every time I think that there's a particular entertainment story that could border on obscenity, we all turn it around and change it. And I have 5 editors on my head telling me what the hell you're doing. Don't even think about it. My question out here is that how do you make a difference between one channel and the other in terms of entertainment?
So leave it to the consumer. Okay, leave it to the consumer. Get funding in form of FDI. Get funding from subscription. You don't have to depend on government ads. Okay, that's what we do.
I just have a couple of concerns, if anyone here can address them. first of all, won't online content regulation impose restrictions on specifically YouTube content creators and bloggers on their freedom to carry on a profession? Because these two things, firstly, are considered legit professions these days. Which brings me to my second point, which is what parameters can possibly be defined to restrict creativity? I understand that there needs to be some restrictions regarding, as we discussed before, child pornography, which I'm not getting into. But on what parameters can creativity be restricted? And thirdly, won't web portals like, say, Netflix or any other portal be hesitant to even enter into a market like India, where there is censorship which would possibly be based on vague grounds and definitions which are not defined, like we just discussed, obscenity?
I mean, we already have theatrical censorship and TV censorship.
Exactly.
Doesn't really mean that we support that, but I mean, like, we are looking forward here.
No, but from a legal perspective, yours was an Article 14 question, right?
Yes, exactly. So what is to say that we won't have 50 more cases of Padmavat?
In India, within our freedom of speech and expression and freedom of livelihood and occupation, they're both falling under the same set of fundamental rights, Article 19. And there is a clear line of judicial approach where even commercial speech has been held to be protected within the right to freedom of speech and expression. So I think going back to the Sakal newspaper case, where the government actually tried to control print media, which was the dominant media back then, by controlling the newsprint, import of the newsprint. Right. Similarly, today in broadcast, that could be something like denying access to satellites. Right. The government could say, okay, you cannot use satellites for broadcast. I'm not telling you that I'm not giving you license, but now you cannot use it for that. And in case of internet, it could be blatant internet shutdowns, right? So, I mean, there is a clear differentiation between those who create the content and the carriage methodologies that are involved in delivering it to the people. So either you control the content creator or you control the delivering methodologies. Today it could be a platform, could be a broadband service provider, anybody. You're basically controlling that. And you're violating the right of the journalist, of the content creator, of the media house. The right to monetize commercial speech, of which the right to monetize and both commercial speech are protected within our fundamental rights in our constitution, to put it in perspective.
No, so what are the things that you as a broadcaster and an online aggregator now are concerned about with this activity that's been undertaken? What are you afraid of? What are some of the risks that you think we face?
So, I mean, as a content creator, because, I mean, just to disclose, I'm from Hotstar. As a content creator, somebody who actively creates content, not just provides a platform for people to upload it on. First of all, there is already a whole lot of investment that is made into making the viewing experience safe for the user, right? So my user might not want certain kind of content to be available to their kids, right? They might only want to view it themselves.
So why don't you create parental controls?
Yeah, exactly. I'm coming to that. I was exactly coming to that. So what I'll do is I'll invest in parental controls, right? But the user-generated content guys probably would not do that. They would simply take the help of Safe Harbor and say, okay, if you notify it within 36 hours, within 30 days, I'll take it down. But for somebody who's creating the content, already investing in making it safe, the threshold of liability is so much higher than the person or the entity which basically is renouncing any responsibility at all.
Trying to then look at sort of types of contents based upon who's making it, the nature of entity who's making it. I mean, that's...
In terms of the burden that kind of is existing between the user-generated content, the professional guys, right? I mean, there has to be some kind of parity where because see, the person creating the content is always the easy target. It's always easy to burden something on which you have ownership. So if a content creator, because of the virtue of having ownership of the content, right, it's always very easy to pin down liability. So this kind of dichotomy that exists within the regulatory structure right now, that definitely needs to be addressed. I'm not asking for increasing somebody's liability. I'm asking for bring it down altogether. And this operates, you know, inter-platform as well. Like the liability of the broadcast guys is so much higher than the digital content. both hugely and professional. Their liability is far lower than them.
So this is interesting. What we saw in case of net neutrality with the telecoms was that they were asking for greater regulatory burden on online players. You as a broadcaster want easing up of regulatory burden from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Like this is where this whole movement or this whole discussion kind of differentiates from the net neutrality debate, because over there the carriage guy, that legacy guy, so to speak, was asking for greater regulation on the innovative technology. Over here the legacy guy is saying reduce my burden as well, reduce theirs as well. Because fact of the matter is, for this industry, for the content industry, content regulation is what we are talking about, freedom of speech and expression is the bread and butter. So one guy cannot say restrict their freedom of speech and expression and let mine prevail. That cannot happen. Both will, at the end of the day, lose.
We continue to work with the old framework. We are continuing to define what a news organization is, what a journalist is. These definitions no longer hold. And as long as we continue to try and kind of preserve these old institutions, we will have a lot of dissonance. There will be a lot of cognitive dissonance.
I have a slightly subversive take on this, which is that I think that prior to the internet, the speakers had a more direct right in terms of questioning the way in which the government was regulating them. And the danger of having our speech mediated via online platforms is that sometimes a platform can take a censorship decision that is not consistent with the constitution, and there's nothing you can do because it's a private party. So I'm just going to throw this out there. What would you think of a world in which users were able to appeal platforms' decisions, and if it's a powerful enough platform, then appeal it all the way into the judiciary?
No platform would ever want to take away content that they've invested in, that they've licensed, that they've made available to their consumers. As I think Arun had said earlier, usually the excess of self-regulation happens when there's a threat of overt regulation, as Subho said, from the state, right? Yeah.
Can I argue with that, or do you want to?
No, okay, just to complete from the state. So it usually happens in that scenario. And that's where one has to disagree with Subho when he says that self-regulatory mechanisms are all total bakwas. No, they're not. Because if there was self-regulatory mechanism, then probably the same rights of appeal would be available to the consumer. In case of a statutory recognized or a statutorily created regulation process, it would in all probability be immediate takedown, not an appeal. Because that's where the interest of government would always lie, or rather the state.
Yeah, so I think that the debates moved on substantially. Earlier when we were debating, this is pre-Shreya Singhal, right? When we were doing the intermediary liability debate, Center for Internet and Society Bangalore had done a piece of research in which they wanted to see how far platforms are over-responding to notices, and they found that that was pretty far. And so I don't think that it's a debate anymore that platforms tend to want to not deal with too much, basically be a little risk averse and not deal with expensive regulation. That doesn't mean that they want to stifle free speech on the platforms. That's just the reality of how markets work, right? And the model that I'm suggesting is actually the one followed by the Internet Watch Foundation, which is not a platform, it's a specific kind of regulatory system, but basically under that system, when content is taken down, there is a splash page saying why. You can appeal through the self-regulatory system, but the beautiful part of this is that if that doesn't work for you, there's a point at which you go into the judiciary. Now, that would obviously not work for all platforms because small operators would find this difficult to comply with, but I think we're in an ecosystem in which you can argue that there are some platforms that wield the kind of power that it's a considerable amount of influence over the public sphere, and then the question to ask is that do you want to leave the speech decision to the platform purely, which is self-regulation, or would you want to take it into the judiciary and evaluate the right?
Again, what Chinmay had stated, and that even the system that Chinmay suggested, the study that she suggested, it presupposes some kind of self-regulation where the consumer can actually approach, right, in some way, either the platform or the body or something, right? I'm not exactly clear what the approach would be. The route to judiciary is anyways open to the people in our law, right? Because there are a whole lot of provisions of IPC, of IT Act, applicable to any online entity, right? You can easily go to a magistrate and file a complaint. Doable. You can approach judiciary anytime in India, and especially on the criminal side, it's not even like kind of a, what should I say, money intensive like civil remedies are. I mean, the state is basically providing you for little or no cost. So that route is already available.
So there's two clarifications. One is that might apply to Hotstar because it's curated content, but a lot of platforms are subject to the safe harbor regulation under the IT Act, and so no, you can't use the IPC because they have the safe harbor protection. But specifically what I was talking about is situations in which platforms over-regulate. And so you're not going to the judiciary saying that there's harmful content on the platform. You're saying that I said something that should have been protected by the Constitution, and the platform over-regulated by taking down speech that has constitutional protection. I'm being provocative. What I'm saying is that constitutional rights might possibly apply on certain online platforms. That is not a settled question of law, but it's different from harmful speech.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the point I'm making exactly. See, the owner of the content creator, the professional content player is liable in thousands of ways, right? You can approach magistrate against that entity. You can directly, maybe you can, file a writ of mandamus to MeitY and ask for action to be taken against them. But the UG guys is so much more protected, right? Basically what's required in the judicial approach is for UG guys, not for the professional content guy, because the professional content entity is anyways amenable to all judicial provisions available. The higher threshold of protection is available to the UG platforms, and so the greater amount of, if some kind of citizen scrutiny has to be brought in, it has to be brought in for them, not for us. We already are liable.
If you are looking hypothetically at self-regulation and developing norms around self-regulation, I'm not saying that you have been, by which I'm saying that you have been. What are some of the things that you're looking at?
Actually, I can say it's not about have been or have been not. I think much of the pressure from the side of state or from side of any agency can be kind of handled if the application / the platform bears some kind of responsibility towards the users. It's recognition of that responsibility, nothing else.
So why would you have industry norms versus norms for
that's just one way of doing it. That's you choose not to do that. Do it that way.
The impact of doing that, of trying to create industry norms, is that then it becomes a mode of regulation of an industry, as opposed to just for an entity to show that what it's doing is in good faith. If you have industry-wide norms, then that becomes used in a manner, and we've seen that in case of, let's say, the Press Council of India guidelines as well.
I mean, norms can also be accepted in good faith, and it's basically an acceptance of responsibility. I'm not advocating any particular kind.
I'm thinking of the time in which they bleeped out the word beef from Friends, and there was this whole show about a beef burger, so that the word beef kept coming up. It was very hard to tell what was going on in that show because there would be beep, beep, beep all through, right? Now, if you put that together with the idea that the citizens of India have the right to access information, even if it is just the word beef, and that we should have a plurality of information available, would you really want to go towards a scenario in which 3 major platforms control all online entertainment and are all a little fearful of where the government's going to take them and are sort of censoring? Genuinely, I saw this movie, and the thing is that the opening scene was cut out because, it was a little R-rated. But the entire point of the movie was the opening scene. So I genuinely did not understand what happened in that movie until I Googled it later, right? So these are the things that I worry about, just to put it on the table.
So Nikhil, I have to start by saying that I'm not an official spokesperson for Amazon, so I'm not privileged to really say very much about internal positions on self-regulation versus not.
So in your personal point of view?
Well, I think, some of the things that we've been thinking about, and I've been thinking about as an independent individual, is that there is, of course, a sense that, just taking from the National Digital Communication Policy that was released earlier this week, there is this emphasis within the government on increasing broadband penetration and making sure that everybody has internet, getting the next billion online. I think one really important data point that for me from just the VOD space or the online entertainment space is that online digital entertainment is today driving internet consumption in India. It's a primary driver really for people, more and more people to come onto the internet. So from that point of view, I think that VODs and platforms such as Amazon Prime Video, Hotstar, Netflix, all of us are playing an important role. I think that any kind of regulation, whether state-imposed or self-regulatory, is likely to have a consequence on the internet in general, and is likely to have several unintended consequences as well. And we should be cognizant of that. As Prime Video, we're obviously tracking every single move. We're very happy to be here and participate in this discussion and listen to everyone's point of view, and make sure that whatever submissions we make, whether through IMAI or anybody else, is productive and has is aligned to what the government of India says its goals are.
So would you be open to the idea of having self-censorship of any kind? And what are the things that you do? Because you did self-censor when you launched, right? There were a bunch of shows which were not available, or they were available in a censored format. What led to that?
So again, Nikhil, I'm not privy to the historical decisions, and again, I'm not privileged to speak on behalf of the company. I'm not an official spokesperson, but I think internally there's a very strong customer centricity value. We learned very quickly. Arundeep wrote several detailed articles on that sort of outline customer feedback about how our attempts at censorship were perceived, and. As you may have noticed, it was part of the reading list as well. The company learned from that, right? So there is internally a lot of reflection on such issues, and we're continuing to watch the debate very closely, and we're hoping to play an important role in shaping the debate in a manner that is a win-win for everybody.
One point that was raised about, that formed the basis of the argument that was raised here about. The basis was differentiating user-generated content and professional content. I'm wondering if that sort of distinction works, because then where do you put videos from, say, a Dice Media or Filter Copy, or even, say, T-Series uploading its videos on YouTube? Does that then become professional or user-generated? How does that distinction work then, if we are envisaging a regulatory framework?
So I think where we're moving towards this platform-specific regulation, because content by itself cannot be regulated, and therefore it's a form of delegated regulation which is coming in. So you regulate platforms to regulate the content, and so you pass on the liability, the burden of that onto the platforms, so whether it's a Facebook or it's a YouTube or it's a Hotstar or it's an Amazon Prime. I think that's broadly the way I think governments will have to deal with it, because frankly it's impossible to regulate content by itself given the number of hours that go up, and also because there are lots of individual content providers which have been empowered by these platforms where they may not have gotten an opportunity to create content for broadcast. In fact, one of the reasons why the Viral Fever started was that they were very unhappy with the kind of content, or even at times the shows were being shot down by broadcasters, and that's when they went online. So we have this situation where there is an opportunity, there is also monetization, there's also a great deal of funding which is available for these content providers. What I'm wondering about, and I've been thinking about this, is what tipped it? So what caused this need for regulation, whether it comes to online news or it comes to online content, where is it the entry of, for example, so one is it the Cambridge Analytica situation in case of Facebook that led to this? Is it the entry of large, powerful, or potentially sort of market capturing platforms that can operate at scale like Amazon Prime and Netflix? Because this wasn't a discussion that was had around YouTube, for example, right? So what is it that caused it?
But I think to answer your question, we were about 3 weeks back, before the Cambridge Analytica story actually broke in and everyone went to town about it in India. We at NETV, I particularly I was doing an entire research on big data and how big data is going to go ahead and actually influence the elections and how it's already done that. I think the simple answer to your question is controlling every single narrative that it possibly can. The government is basically perhaps, and this is something nobody can prove. There is no proof. Be very clear about this. So I know that I can't say this. I'm saying this in an independent capacity right now. Sorry, I have to repeat what everyone else has been saying. But the bottom line is that you can't prove right now, today, that the government is trying to control whether it's narrative on Hotstar, on Amazon, or on news televisions, or online spaces, on Facebook, on Twitter. They are trying to control it. You can't prove that. But are they? If you just stop beating around the bush, nobody's really answered any questions about where it really came down to, and that's what you're trying to get to.
Sorry, I'm just processing that because one of the things that was different between the initial fake news regulation of journalists that came out and this one was the inclusion of entertainment.
So I think the tipping point comes when we moved from click-based economy to engagement-based economy. That's when problems like violent videos, hate speech, etc. started getting amplified. And that is where, I mean, yeah, you need to start regulating platforms. You need to hurt their business models. There is no other way.
We did realize, based on what you just said, that when it's about narrative, each political party, whether it be the Congress or the BJP, is trying to gain ground in firstly making sure that the person who is going to vote is, they have realized, perhaps not misinformed, but not aptly informed about who they should vote for and why. So what they're doing is they're putting information out there that is perhaps potentially going to brainwash you. And I was speaking to a professor in the New York Stern University recently, and he mentioned this, that this is common, and Donald Trump did this, and Cambridge Analytica was about this. They can actually, if you are a fringe voter, you're not sure that in the coming Karnataka elections, you know who you're going to vote for, BJP or the Congress, then they will find out through watching your Facebook profile, who is it that you're perhaps going to vote for, and in the space of entertainment, for example. And then they will send you messages, targeted messages based on that. So it's about changing the narrative with the ambition of actually potentially thinking that you can change the mindset of a person.
Even now, for example, the videos that are circulating on WhatsApp are again, part of it is entertainment, part of it is problematic content as well. But that's not coming up in this discussion.
I guess the key takeaway here is that a harms-based approach towards regulation, and the object of regulation, like we both said, should be central to society when we look out for what to regulate. So yeah, I guess we'll wrap there. Thank you, everyone, very much.